DesignerCon is a massive annual convention featuring designer toys, custom action figures, and loads upon loads of unique collectible art. And this year, I was asked to be a part of the 1M Robots booth. This is Gamey Builds, and this is the story behind that build.
We're going to be doing a really cool art show at DesignerCon this coming November, and we've actually printed out the 200% size, so a little bit bigger than this, and we've sent it out to a handful of artists, and we're going to actually have a really cool art show at DesignerCon at our booth. If you're not able to come, stay tuned because we'll post videos.
Dr. Toys, a staple of the toy community here on YouTube, was the one who invited me to take part in the show, and shortly thereafter sent me this package with a robot toy to paint and modify. Right out of the box, I loved the chunky, blocky design, and while I knew this wouldn't work as a typical Beyond the Blight build, I fully intended to give it the flavor of my world, making it Blight adjacent, if you will. The first thing I wanted to change was the height, which meant making these legs a lot longer. After measuring the diameter and paying a visit to my local hardware store, I purchased a wooden dowel and cut it into short lengths to replace the legs and arms, since the original dowels were made from metal, and for adhesion purposes, I thought wood would be preferable. I really liked working with this material, and at first I thought that Dr. Toys had somehow crafted it from wood. It wasn't until later when I had to drill through the stuff that I realized it was plastic printed on an FDM printer. After getting it all pieced together with the new wooden dowels, it was time to take a step back and figure out how I'd make this thing my own. While I didn't want to cover up too much of the toy's original texture, I did want to increase the level of detail, so I scanned in each of the parts' faces. This gave me a very accurate footprint that I could then use as a canvas to create custom panels. All of this was done in Adobe Animate, an easy-to-use vector program that is my absolute go-to for this kind of thing. Having these exact scans was a huge help in getting each of the panels to fit just right, and once the designs were exported to SVGs and run through my laser printer on a sheet of 1mm chipboard, this was the result. This very first model of mine, built in 2021, was also made mostly of chipboard. Back in those days, I'd just slap a coat of paint directly onto the surface, and the result was a warped, bumpy texture. These days, though, I've learned my lesson, and I always coat chipboard in Mod Podge, which is superior to regular PVA glue in that it contains lacquer, which hardens permanently once dry. In some cases, like with this robot's head, I'll attach a second layer of chipboard as the first layer's Mod Podge is still tacky so that I can avoid superglue, which tends to leave residue. For the head, I also hacked up some Gundam bits, then attached them to some aircraft wheels and glued them to the robot's head, since the original disc design really reminded me of my very first Beyond the Blight build, and I thought the rabbit ear antenna would be a nice little nod to that design. With all the panel details in place, I dry fit the robot together. And while I liked the overall aesthetic, I felt like it was really missing something, so it was time for some brainstorming. While the original feet did the job just fine, I felt like my robot could really benefit from something a little more stylish. So I whipped out my sketchbook and threw together a bunch of concepts. After settling on a design I liked, I went into Blender to make this thing a reality. This actually took me a couple of versions, as I went a little too detailed and realistic on this first attempt, resulting in something that just didn't juxtapose well with the simple blocky bot. What I ended up with instead were these, which I felt struck the right balance. For further detail, I cut up some short lengths of this PVC pipe to add cuffs to the appendages, which resembled socks here above the feet and shorts here on the upper legs. To match this style to the hands, which already had pipe-like wrists, I halved the length with a jeweler saw. Then, after adding a wad of green stuff, I sculpted with a silicone tool for a faux rubber robot joint. This would nudge the style of the bot just a bit closer to my mecha designs, while providing more surface area for gluing later. I also 3D printed him a robo backpack and a retro boombox. After spray painting the boombox black, I added on some laser cut meshes and rims. Of course, now I faced a major issue. Since the boombox had to be on this guy's shoulder, the arm needed to be fully redesigned to hold it in place. Why I do this to myself, I do not know. Because the dowels had already been glued in place, I started my modification of the left arm by hacking the thing off, then drilling a slightly off-centered hole so that the shoulder would sit more or less flush with the torso. Then, using a thick copper wire and hollow acrylic tubing, I softened everything with a heat gun and slowly bent it into the right shape. I probably could have gotten away with just acrylic tubing here, but I wanted exposed wire on both ends so that I could glue it into the drilled holes in the hand and shoulder. And this, I think, really underscores the most challenging aspect of this build. This wasn't just a project for myself to be videoed and then stuck on a shelf and forgotten. This thing needed to be sturdy and secure, so I did my best not to cut any corners. To further bulk out the appendages and harken back to previous Beyond the Blight designs, I added epoxy sculpt, then carefully sculpted in rows upon rows of grooves, similar to the shoulder joints seen earlier. There's a trick to sculpting this stuff that I've learned with experience, and that is when to sculpt epoxy. If you do it immediately, the putty is often too soft, which means it dents and deforms too easily. But after waiting an hour or so before sculpting, its slightly harder surface makes it much easier to work with. I realized at this point that the legs were still looking a bit spindly for my taste, so I decided to make knee guards from the original robot's feet. With the epoxy sculpt still not fully cured, I simply pressed them into place. I could then glue the body together. Except it was actually not the right time to do this because I'd forgotten I needed to attach the backpack, which was heavy, so simply drilling holes wasn't going to cut it. I pried the whole robot apart, cut some copper wire to length, and then made sure the wire was totally secure on the inside. I then glued everything back together. It was at this point, late in the game, that I realized I wanted something in the robot's other hand, though I wasn't sure exactly what, so I drilled a hole and decided to figure it out later. With all the pieces built and ready, I carefully suspended everything with alligator clips and stuck them into styrofoam for priming. Of course, before painting, there was one more important element that needed to be built. The bases for my builds typically mimic natural terrain: rock, sand, grass, moss, and so forth. But this project was ripe for experimentation, so I decided to try something like a concrete pour. To reinforce the pour, I started with a wire mesh from this cheap grease screen. After tracing the shape out of the base, I cut out a square. This would basically do what rebar does with real concrete, improving structural integrity and reducing flex. I then mixed up some plaster of Paris, water, Mod Podge, then added a bit of paint for coloration. While it's true that I could have just painted after the plaster dried, adding color now meant that if the plaster chipped during the subsequent steps, the underlying color wouldn't be pure white. After building a frame around the base using popsicle sticks, I carefully pried it away, laid down my wire mesh on some wax paper, then did the pour. I also added this length of styrene for a curb seam, and though it sort of got lost after adding thickness to the concrete with an additional pour, it did serve its purpose eventually. And with all of that done, it was on to painting. Now, I know many of you watching will be disappointed to hear that I don't have a story for you this time. To date, I've written 19 short stories for my Beyond the Blight series here on YouTube, and I'm working on my first full-length novel right now. Once the first draft is finally finished, which has taken me almost 2 years to write, I'll be working with a handful of test readers and editors who applied to assist with this project on my website a few months ago. There will be a limited number of signed and numbered hardcover copies, which will be available for pre-order as we get a little closer to the release. The books will also be available for purchase on Amazon as paperbacks, and of course, I will release an audiobook version, which I'll narrate myself. I started painting the robot with a rattle can base coat of dark brown, then did some quick shading with an even darker shade of brown. This has become my regular workflow now with most projects. I use standard spray paint for a base coat, then apply a top coat of airbrushed acrylic paint. In this case, I went with a candy red. Dark gray acrylic was then brushed onto all the appendages. This has become my go-to color for rubber boot joints, and I felt it worked well here against the red. One color choice I was less sure of was this white for the panels, which immediately felt like a barn door, so I eventually went back and toned it down with a more off-white color. As with most things, painting is a skill that gets better with practice. For precise lines, a brush with a flat or pointed tip is a must, and having just the right amount of paint on the brush is also important. Paint coverage can be a tricky thing when dealing with light colors on top of dark base coats, and this is where using high-quality acrylic modeling paints is really helpful. To be completely honest, I don't see a lot of difference in using the cheap craft acrylics when airbrushing, since they need to be diluted anyway, but when painting by brush, it's definitely worth it to get the higher quality products. As you can see from me painting with this gray Vallejo acrylic, you can sometimes get away with a single coat. On the other hand, this neon green, which was less than $1 for a 2-ounce bottle, took many, many coats to become opaque. And with more coats comes more uneven texture, so in hindsight, it would have been wise to splurge on a higher quality version of this color. To give the robot a little more dimension, I next went back and highlighted some of the edges, like these ridges on the appendages. I'm using the same dark gray base with a bit of off-white mixed in for a lighter color. For the edges of the red parts, I added just a bit of yellow into the base color and painted. These effects are so subtle that you don't immediately notice they're there, but they make a big difference, helping the finished product to really pop. For the weathering effects, I started with some black Tamiya panel liner. Something very important that I don't often hear people talk about when using these products is that the pigment will often settle in the bottom of the jar. In some cases you may want that, if for example you're going for a very subtle grime effect, but for bolder color, it's essential to occasionally shake the bottle. I found this to be true of all my oil and enamel paints. Another important thing to keep in mind is that using the effects is often very messy, and you won't get it right by simply applying it to your model. The key is going back and blending. In my case, I'm using a paintbrush dipped in mineral spirits. Oh, and be sure to mask up for this, as these chemicals are potent and toxic. In this example, you can see the difference after that touch-up work with the mineral spirits. The stains are less subtle and the overall color has been slightly tinted from the original base. Next, with a Q-tip dipped in isopropyl alcohol, I was able to wear off the acrylic top coat to reveal the brown spray paint underneath. I finally went in with a very fine brush to add more prominent grime stains to some of the crevices. I'm using a very dark brown acrylic paint for this. I added some to the raised panel edges as well for a chipped paint effect. I next attached the appendages with a combination of superglue to quickly lock the position in and Gorilla Glue for a long-term, very secure hold. You'll notice too that I slightly spread the robot's toes outwards and angled the hips forward to give him a more dynamic pose. Finally, I attached the right arm, then made a very janky support system with alligator clips to be sure the pose wouldn't change as the Gorilla Glue dried. The first step here was filling in the gap between the two decorative frames that made up the base. I'm using modeling paste here, which can be sanded like plaster after hardening. Once sanded, I spray painted it all black, and repeated this step once more for an even smoother, more uniform finish. I then removed the forms and wax paper for the poured concrete. I masked up, then sanded down the edges. I then used a scoring blade to search for that bit of styrene that had been lost in the pour, which will make an appearance in a moment. This square was surprisingly strong and took a bit of brute force to crack, and I was sure glad I added that wire mesh, which kept all the pieces together. This is where the styrene piece finally popped out, creating an unexpected but welcome chipped concrete effect as it did. I next painted the cracked concrete slab, then added some variation with lighter grays stippled here and there. For weathering, the ground got roughly the same treatment as the robot, using brown and black Tamiya panel liner for the crevices, then blending it in with mineral spirits. I also used some of this AK Interactive slime effect paint for variation. I applied a generous amount of Gorilla Glue to the wooden base, stuck on the concrete, and weighed it down with a brick overnight to completely set. I then added some Mod Podge to the larger cracks and sprinkled in dirt and green flocking. A few of the larger cracks also got some tufts of miniature grass. Finally, I drilled some holes in the base and added these clear acrylic rods for supports. The boots, which had already been drilled, could then be set in place. If you're an 80s or a 90s kid, you may remember having a boombox like this and waiting beside it after school for your favorite song to come on the radio so you could press record and capture it on cassette tape. I want to say that the first song I did this with was either 1 Week by Bare Naked Ladies or All Star by Smash Mouth. Let me know what yours was in the comments. After the baby blue paint job, weathering was done, as before, by rubbing a Q-tip dipped in alcohol along the edges. Isopropyl alcohol dissolves acrylic paint while not disturbing the oil-based enamel paint from the base coat. This means that once the top coat is down, I can do all sorts of chipping effects without altering the base color. And then the whole thing was grimed up with some black Tamiya panel liner, and then touched up. Some dials were printed and glued on the face of the boombox, along with an AM/FM tuner band. UV resin was applied to the top of this and then cured to give the appearance of a glass window. Then came the tape deck, and after that, a few miniaturized Gamey Builds stickers. And speaking of merch, for those who submitted requests for a reprint of my Mecha Jogari shirt, it's back, both in the original navy color and for the first time ever, black. As always, they are screen-printed designs on super comfy cotton polyester t-shirts. Go check them out at gameybuilds.com. As the project neared to a close, I finally settled on adding a couple of shopping bags to the robot's empty hand. Because this guy was giving some serious 90s vibes, I felt that a decade-appropriate pattern was a good fit. I designed that pattern in Animate, fine-tuning it by creating a 3x3 grid from a repeating symbol, then making sure none of the parts overlapped. I then worked up the bag's template, and in Photoshop I imported the pattern, cropped it right at the pattern seams, then used the Define Pattern feature to make it a tileable pattern, which I then used to fill the bag's background. This allowed me to easily scale and rotate the pattern till it was just right. A second bag was a fun little happy face made from bolts and screws, and once these bags were designed, I had them laser printed on high-quality paper at a local print shop. I carefully cut everything out, and then scored the crease lines with the back of my knife. A bit of Mod Podge helped to glue the overlapping edges in place, and then it was all assembled and glued. At this point, it was simply a matter of gluing on short lengths of electrical wire. The open ends were then threaded through the hands and glued to the bags. And that was that. Thank you all so much for watching, and thanks to Dr. Toys for inviting me to be a part of his 1M Robots display. If you're in the Las Vegas area and would like to see this build in person, you can find more info in the video description. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds. Over.